Trophic levels tell us about the position of an organism in its ecosystem. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to talk about energy transfer between trophic levels, assess the productivity of different ecosystems, and then we're going to discuss complexities for organisms higher up the trophic levels. Now, to start off with, we'll have a look at trophic levels and what they actually mean and how energy flows through them. Let's take another simple food chain. So the food chain in this particular example starts off at the bottom with the sun, and the sun gives light energy to, in this case, a plant, and the plant is fed upon by a grasshopper. The grasshopper is eaten by a mouse, which is then in turn eaten by a hawk. Okay, now trophic levels, like we said, tell us the position of an organism in the ecosystem. Okay, so the sun doesn't form part of the ecosystem in this particular case, so it doesn't count as a level. The first level will be the primary producers. Okay, so this is any kind of plants in this particular ecosystem. These particular producers are responsible for photosynthesis, harnessing light energy and turning it into food, such as sugars. These in turn go on to feed our next level. Our next level are our primary consumers. So primary meaning the first level, okay? Not the first level of the trophic order, but the first level of consumerism, okay? Now, this then goes on to feed secondary consumers and so on to tertiary consumers. So it's important that we notice here there are two primaries here. One is a primary producer and the other is a primary consumer. In terms of trophic levels, we have the first, second, third, and fourth levels in this particular example. There isn't a fifth level in this particular example, and we might explore why that is shortly. Now, let's just have a think about why we might not have a fifth level in this particular case. And what we need to do in this case is just consider where energy comes from. So let's just take an amount of energy. So we're going to take 1 million joules of sunlight coming from the sun and hitting planet Earth, which the plants have access to. Now, generally speaking, plants are able to trap about 1% of the energy from the sun in the form of photosynthesis. So this makes up about 10,000 joules, which we're going to represent with this block here. Now, 10,000 joules is what the plant has to do everything it needs to do, to grow, to reproduce, etc. Now, some of this energy is going to be passed on to the next level. And what we tend to understand is that at this point, about 10% of the energy from the sun is passed on to the primary consumers at this point, and this makes up about 1,000 joules of energy. And this is represented with this particular block here. Now, this is not to scale, so don't go measuring those blocks. It's just a representation at the moment. So the 1,000 joules that have been passed from the primary producers to the primary consumers are now available to that primary consumer to grow, to move, to reproduce, etc. Now, 10% of this is passed on to the level. So 100 joules is passed on to the mouse. And then 10% again, 10 joules, is passed on to the tertiary consumers. And what we now have, essentially, is an energy pyramid. Okay, so this shows the energy transfer through the ecosystem from the sun all the way down or up to the hawk, the tertiary consumer at the top. What this pyramid also represents is the amount of biomass present in the ecosystem at any given time. And you can also correlate this with population size. So generally speaking, the population of the grasshoppers in this particular ecosystem is going to be higher than the population of mice, which should also then be higher than the population of hawks at the top. There are all sorts of other correlations you can draw from this particular example, but what's really important is to understand that as energy transfers through an ecosystem, only about 10% is passed from level to level. Now, what we might be thinking then is where that energy goes. Now, energy is lost to the environment at every single level. Energy transfer as food and is lost as heat and waste, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth in a minute. Less energy is available at the higher levels, and this does make some complexities that we're going to talk about in a minute. Now, where does that energy go? What we need to realise is, so this is a cow, just an example of a primary consumer. If 100% of is eaten, and this is what you can see in the green box, 100% of the energy goes in, around 40% is lost through heat, 10% is lost through excretion, and 25% is lost through respiration. And it leaves only about 25% to form into tissues and biomass. And it's the biomass that is passed on to the next level. What we have to understand is that when that cow is eaten by the next level, not all biomass is consumed by the next level. So there may be indigestible parts of the cow, like bones, for example, that aren't used at the next level. And this is especially the case in nature. So that's where the energy goes. Now, understanding trophic levels and energy allows us to make some calculations around ecosystems, and this gets quite complex now. And we have a look at productivity. Now, productivity essentially looks at the amount of energy that an ecosystem is able to harness from the sun. In this particular case, we can measure it in two key ways. Gross primary productivity is the total amount of organic matter produced by photosynthesis. So this is the sheer amount of productivity that allows you to grow a plant. Okay, and what we need to realize is that gross primary productivity goes into the production of parts of the plant which may not be useful to the next level, etc., or useful to the plant itself, is in biomass. Now, this leads us then to net primary productivity, and this is the energy that remains available to the plant for growth after subtracting the amount of energy that the plant uses for respiration. And it's that net primary productivity that is available to the other trophic levels. Now, this map shows us the regions of the Earth where primary productivity as it is at its highest. And these are the dark green regions that you can see around the top of South America, around the middle of Africa, and certainly around Southeast Asia and the islands of like Indonesia, Papua New Guinea. These are actually the places where we find rainforests. Now, what we tend to find in terms of net primary productivity is that the open oceans and the tropical rainforests are the two most productive biomes on planet Earth. The open ocean tends to sit here because of its sheer size and because of the amount of algae and phytoplankton that exists within it. The tropical rainforests are most productive on the Earth because of two key conditions. This is warmth and moisture, which are two really important parts to this. Now, when we correlate productivity with biodiversity, and biodiversity is another measure we haven't yet covered, and we will look at later in the course, is a measure of all the different types of species that exist in that particular biome or that particular ecosystem. So the higher the biodiversity, the more different species that exist in that particular place. And our hotspots tend to be correlated with areas where productivity is highest. There's more energy available to support more different species. Warmer climates with presence of water and moisture are most productive. So these are places like the rainforests that we just talked about. Okay, so we move on to the next bit. So it's not all good news necessarily. So there are some complexities with regards to energy transfer. Now, how many trophic levels can an ecosystem support? This does depend on a lot of things. Now, what we tend to find is that land-based ecosystems tend to have around about 5 trophic levels maximum. Marine ecosystems can have up to 7, and this is to do with the fact that the primary producers at the base of the ecosystem are quite simple. They're plankton, and when they are consumed, almost all of their bodies are digestible and usable for energy content. Now, the answer depends completely on several factors, and this includes the amount of energy entering the ecosystem in the first place. So if the ecosystem is around the equator, there's going to be more energy available. If it's at the North Pole, in a tundra, there's going to be less light available, and so therefore there's going to be potentially fewer trophic levels. The energy loss between trophic levels. So this depends again on how active the animals are at each level, how much indigestible material they produce, and how much they perhaps reproduce, and all sorts of things that use energy. Are they warm-blooded? Are they cold-blooded? These are sort of things that we need to take into account. The form, structure, physiology, and diet of organisms at each level is really important as well. And populations at higher trophic levels tend to be much, much smaller. We've already considered that point. If we look at those animals at the top of the trophic level, there are some real complexities for them. Apex predators have it good in the sense that nothing's going to eat them necessarily. They are at the top of the food chain. The only thing that are going to be a threat to them is organisms of the same species. These particular creatures tend to have quite small populations, but what you might find is that they do have to work extremely hard to get the food that they need. So they may need to cover vast territories, and they may need to hunt, which a lot of them will do. They will try and conserve energy when they can, and they will generally put less energy into reproduction and things like that. They won't do it on a very regular basis. Now, another way around this problem is to become what you can see in the bottom right corner, and these are scavengers. Scavengers are predators that feed off other animals' kills. Okay, so coyotes, hyenas, vultures are your kind of key examples of these. These creatures save energy by not hunting, and rather than hunting, they go and eat carcasses. And this means that they get the meat that they require, but they don't have to go chasing around for it. And that's another way that you may get that fifth trophic level that exists, but it is quite rare to find these. So let's summarize. Energy enters the ecosystem at trophic level 1 in the producers from sunlight. Consumers obtain about 10% of the energy from the previous level. Energy is lost as heat, waste, and indigestible tissue. Productivity is highest in warm and wet climates around the equator, certainly in rainforests, and in the oceans, coral reefs. And animals need to adapt to survive at higher trophic levels, as we've seen in our examples of apex predators and scavengers. And that is all for this video, so you can have a go at the quiz now. Good luck.